Hey YouTube, the video you are currently watching signifies the beginning of a collaborative project between Veritas, DawaFilms, and myself, and our joint belief that the non-belief of atheism requires justification to be a viable position. Now, as you listen to my individual arguments on the subject, please be aware that DawaFilms and Veritas each in turn will present their additional arguments unique to them on the topic. The result, hopefully, is three separate yet unified and robust arguments for the claim that in order for atheism to be justified in its non-belief, it needs positive arguments in its favor. Now, since this is such a heated point and topic, let me off the bat state clearly that I am in no way championing the view that atheism exclusively shoulders the burden of proof. Rather, what I propose is that both the theist and the atheist ought to provide justification for their views. That being said, I want to propose why I think atheism requires justification in order to be viable. Now, no doubt atheists will be aware of the distinction between negative and positive atheism. Further, if you are following my arguments carefully so far, you will realize that my initial beef is not against positive atheism insofar as they offer positive arguments for their position, but rather negative atheism and the idea of a lack of belief due to insufficient evidence or unconvincing evidence. The notion of a lack of belief is derived from the Greek prefix a, which can mean no, absence of, without, lack of, or not. However, while negative atheism views this prefix to mean lack of, it would seem positive atheism views this prefix to mean not. Now, I generally wonder what criteria atheists use to differentiate between the two translations with the Greek prefix a, if indeed any. But regardless, these two uses of the prefix are demonstrated in the standard philosophical work, the Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy, the second edition, which states the following, quote, "Atheism, from the Greek a, not, and theos, God. The view that there are no gods. A widely used sense denotes merely not believing in God and is consistent with agnosticism. A stricter sense denotes a belief that there is no God. This use has become a standard one. In the Apologies, Socrates is accused of atheism for not believing in the official Athenian gods. Some distinguish between theoretical atheism and practical atheism, A theoretical atheist is one who self-consciously denies the existence of a supreme being, whereas a practical atheist may believe that a supreme being exists, but lives as though there is no God," end quote. So according to this standard work then, atheism is understood to have at least two typical meanings, but positive atheism has become the standard definition. Now, all this to say that while I am aware of the two definitions of atheism, I tend to agree with the Cambridge Dictionary and view positive atheism as less ambiguous than negative atheism. If you lack a belief, then how do you view the probability of God's existence or the attainability of knowledge of God? Negative atheism's unconvinced position is in no way clear. But regardless of which definition an atheist chooses, and now this is key here, regardless of which definition an atheist chooses, there appears to be a dichotomy for the atheist if he refuses to argue with positive arguments for his position. If the atheist chooses positive atheism, then he is guilty of an argument from ignorance. However, the atheist chooses negative atheism instead, then he commits a non sequitur, wherein he cannot offer any justification for his non-belief. Now let me explain this. An argument from ignorance is fallacious reasoning that states a view or claim is false only because it has not been proven to be true. Thus, when the positive atheist argues that there is a lack of evidence of religious hypotheses and then concludes from this lack of evidence that nothing divine exists, he commits an argument from ignorance. To avoid this, the atheist must instead offer positive arguments against God's existence, which is tantamount to Veritas, DawaFilms, and my argument. Conversely, a non sequitur occurs when information does not logically follow from a premise or a conclusion. This pertains to the negative atheism claim of lacking a belief in X. When asked the question, "Do you believe in X?" where X equals the belief in God's existence, and one responds with, "I lack a belief in X," then the atheist is neither confirming nor denying their stance on X. Thus, this does not answer the question posed. There is no way to infer from this lack of belief whether the individual is a weak agnostic, a strong agnostic, a verificationist, or even if one thinks the question is incoherent. Hence, the negative atheist's lack of belief in X does not answer the question posed, i.e., do you believe in X? And if the atheist's response does not answer the question posed, then one cannot provide justification for non-belief in X, for one has not addressed the original question. Concisely then, it seems that the statement, "I lack a belief in X," is not answering the question, "Do you believe in X?" but rather, "Do any of your beliefs refer to X?" and thus again is a non sequitur. What about insufficient evidence? Does that not justify the atheist position? This is a second main contention that I like to argue against, and would suggest a contrary position, namely, an appeal to insufficient evidence does not justify non-belief. First, the atheistic philosopher Michael Scriven states in order to maintain that the absence of evidence renders the existence of God improbable, one is justified in believing that God does not exist from this only if 1. God is not something that might leave no traces behind, and 2. We have comprehensively surveyed the area where the evidence would be found if this entity exists. Thus, if Scriven is correct, then in order for insufficient evidence to justify atheism, one needs to establish 1. The probability that God would leave more evidence of his existence behind than what we already have, and 2. The probability that we have comprehensively surveyed the field of evidence of his existence. Now, I think that under the shadow of these 2 points, negative atheism, if it wishes to respond, would take on a burden of proof that it simply cannot sustain. On proposition 1 alone, for example, if we take several predicated attributes of God, such as immaterial, timeless, spaceless, and a personal mind, then how could the efforts of science attempt to discover such a non-natural entity, to name one method of discovery? How can the scientific method that relies on the predictable ever be in a good position to dethrone the miraculous? How does science discover a being that is outside of the empirical scope? Simply based on such predications, then, it would seem that the inference made on God's existence from such events as the source of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, etc., are in harmony with God's attributes and very nature. Concisely, then, it seems to me that God is a being that either 1, by his very predicated nature, is difficult to attain by empirical means, or 2, God has sufficient reasons for remaining hidden. Thus, a lack of evidence is in no way justification for atheism without a positive argument that justifies their non-belief. Second, to be justified in one's atheism or champion it as truth over theism, one must offer positive arguments in its favor if they wish to be persuasive. If we assume that the reasons for believing in theism are unreasonable, meaning they are false or unconvincing to the atheist, this by no means offers justification for atheism. Assuming that it is unreasonable to believe in theism, this does not itself prove that theism is false and atheism is true. Hence, theism's mere unreasonableness does not mean atheism is more probable than theism. To show that, atheists would need to demonstrate that it is reasonable to believe theism false, and to show that, he must offer positive arguments that demonstrate it is reasonable to believe in atheism over theism. Hence, again, an appeal to insufficient evidence does not justify non-belief. Third and lastly, it's hard to see how the move from absence of evidence to justification for one's non-belief from that is not a move from a dubious inductive premise to a universal claim. Now consider the following 5 propositions. 1. There appears to be no God, thus I do not know if there is a God. 2. There appears to be no God, but by God's very nature he could remain hidden. 3. There appears to be no God, but in fact God may have morally sufficient reasons to be hidden. 4. There appears to be no God, thus there is no God. And 5. There appears to be no God, thus I'm justified in non-belief. Note here that I'm using the term hidden to indicate a lack of evidence. The problem here, as detailed above, is that the mere fact that there is an alleged insufficient amount of evidence leads to many possible constructions of differing hypotheses, for example 1 through 5. Now obviously these hypotheses cancel each other out, so not all can be right. But then, if a piece of evidence, specifically the insufficiency of evidence provided, is consistent with a series of theories, each of which excludes the other, it will be very difficult and hard to make a decisive case for any of the theories by appealing solely to the evidence in question, i.e. the insufficiency of the evidence. Thus, we should be very cautious about the conclusion of justification from the move of apparent insufficient evidence to justification in non-belief, as there are multiple hypotheses available for this exclusive fact. Thus, given the imprecise nature of negative atheism along with philosophy's standard definition, the danger of fallacious reasoning either in the form of an argument from ignorance or a non sequitur, and 3. The failure of insufficient evidence to justify non-belief, it follows from this that in order for atheism to be justified in its non-belief, it needs positive arguments in its favor.